Hi, everyone. Everyone hear me okay? Sorry, I'm significantly shorter than David. Thanks so much, David, for the kind introduction and reminding us that, yes, controversies are certainly not absent from U.S. election, but I think in many ways this one is unprecedented, which we'll get into in our talk today. And also I want to thank the Australian Intercultural Society and Mr. Ahmed Kiskin for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to talk to you today. So where to begin, really? Where do we even start with this election? Like I said, in so many ways, it really is unprecedented. It's fair to say that we really haven't witnessed an election like this one in modern presidential politics for many reasons. The first among them is that we have the first female presidential nominee in American history. That is a very big deal, but it is a point that's been lost, I think, partly because of who that nominee is, which is Hillary Rodham Clinton. Her campaign has only recently begun to emphasize the historic nature of her candidacy, because while having a female president is groundbreaking, especially because it's looking much more and more likely that she will win this election, Clinton herself is a problematic candidate for lots of reasons. She does not feel groundbreaking because she's been so well known. She's been around for so long. She's been in public service forever. The public knows her for the better part of 30 years she's been in the public eye. She has a troubled reputation. Much of the US electorate does not trust her. She has compromised ethics. She is really also the embodiment of the establishment in an anti-establishment year in politics around the world. And Americans are also very deeply uncomfortable with this idea of dynastic politics. So there's this belief about her that she's inheriting her position, because of her husband was president, her long time in politics, her experiences being thrown back in her face because of that. So while her nomination and most likely presidency is truly groundbreaking, the individual herself is problematic in that sense. Secondly, why it's unprecedented is that the candidacy and campaign of Donald J. Trump is equally so. He has completely upended the norms of politics in the United States. He has upended the norms of what a presidential candidate should look like, what he should say, what he should sound like. And his candidacy, frankly, has started off as a joke in the United States and around the world. Nobody took him seriously, especially the establishment, especially many within the Republican Party. And now, not only is he taken seriously, but he's actually considered a danger by many in the US and around the world. So I think many of you are here, obviously, because you follow this very closely. There's a lot that has already been said about this election, whether it's Clinton and her email scandals, the baggage of her husband, the numerous outrageous statements that Trump has made, his questionable relationship with Russia, his nativism, the shunning of traditional allies, sexual assault allegations, all of that messy stuff I'm sure you all know about and have followed very closely. So I don't want to delve too much into that right now because I think this is something that's already out there. But what I'd like to do instead in the time that I have, and hopefully I can do it briefly so we can have more of a discussion and a question and answer, is I want to draw out a few themes, about 4 or 5 themes that I think that this US election can teach us about what's going on in the world globally and the position of the United States at the moment and how that relates to Australia and the Asia-Pacific region. And I think these are things that have not been as drawn out as a lot of the kind of more unsavory yet sexy controversies of this election. And the first trend I think that we need to talk about is that this US presidential election, it's part of a larger trend that's going on around the world, and that's particularly in the West, of an anti-establishment trend. Both sides of the aisle in the US are experiencing an anti-establishment mood. Both the Trump supporters and the Sanders supporters share a lot of similar grievances. The Trump phenomenon and the Bernie Sanders movement is also very similar to the dynamics surrounding the Brexit vote. It's very similar to the resurrection of Pauline Hanson here in Australia. These dynamics that are at play have brought about this kind of alt-right that has taken over a lot of the countries in the West. There's a real backlash against the establishment, against globalization, against this idea of small L liberalism that has been the governing principle for so long in the West. It's because we have seen too many people in the West losing out to globalization and who have not seen the benefits trickle down to them. Many people are disparaging and distrustful of the elites after the global financial crisis. And both Trump and I think the Bernie Sanders movement within the Democratic Party tapped into these very real concerns and this disenchantment among the public there. Many people have lost out to globalization. Jobs have disappeared, wages are stagnant. Many people feel that they are not better off than the previous generation, which is unprecedented. There's a feeling that you should do better than your parents, and for many people in Western cities, that's not the case. Inequality has become a huge issue in the United States. It's becoming more so in Australia and in other parts in Europe and other Western capitals, and these inequality gaps have kind of widened into these chasms. So until Trump and Sanders, really, there has been no mainstream voice for these people who are experiencing these grievances. Traditional Democrats, I think, in the United States have been focusing too much on identity politics, and traditional Republicans have continued to kind of hew to this idea of trickle-down economics that really has not benefited the middle class, but have rather benefited the wealthy and the merchant class in the United States. So there's a real dissonance, I think, in both parties between a big segment of supporters on either side. So I think unless this changes in America, in Australia, in Europe, and elsewhere, we're going to continue to have very large and very growing disaffected segment of the public. And this also is part of the opposition against Clinton, in a sense, because if it's an anti-establishment mood, there is no one who is more establishment than Clinton. And that's why when you hear Trump supporters, for example, say she should be in jail or she's a danger, or people really feel like she is an existential threat. Because for many people in the electorate, the establishment is dangerous. The elite is dangerous, and it has been. Because keep in mind, it was the liberal establishment that brought us the financial crisis, an unworkable EU. Establishment figures like Angela Merkel kind of predicated the European migration crisis by having these open borders. And Clinton is viewed in the same way. So for many people, the establishment, the status quo is dangerous. As much as the focus has been on Trump and all of his outrageous announcements, for a lot of people in the electorate and the body politic, that establishment is unworkable and dangerous for them as well. So for decades, political elites around the world have trumpeted the positives of globalization, and there have been benefits. And make no mistake, all of us in this room are part of the elite who have benefited from globalization. We are the beneficiaries, but the people outside of this room and outside of this table, particularly in working and manufacturing classes, have not benefited. So globalization has a Janus face. It has its positives and its negatives, and the backlash against the negatives is what we're seeing now. So you see Trump and Sanders railing against trade agreements, and part of that has been the backbone and the fabric of globalization. So those that have brought the benefits but have hurt also many in the West. The free movement of people has brought in a lot of benefits as well. We have immigration and travel. It's opened up the world to many of us. But it's also left a lot of people saying, well, I don't know my country, or I don't know where I'm from. Rapid advances in technology have left many people spinning and unable to adapt. So it's all these dynamics that play into this anti-globalization, anti-establishment mood. And these are really very real concerns. And if we don't address them, and if this US presidential election doesn't satisfy it in some way, we're going to continue to see a rise of nativism, of racism, of isolationism in the United States. And that's not just in America and during particularly this election, but I think around the world and elsewhere. Because Sanders, even though he didn't win the nomination, his candidacy and his supporters have put a lot of pressure on Clinton to go into this anti-globalization and anti-trade stance, which we have seen with her reversal of the TPP, for example. So the second and also related trend that I want to talk about is the potential rise of authoritarianism in the West, and it being a real risk to the liberal modern of Western democracy. I spent a lot of my time focusing on the Middle East and the politics of the Middle East, and we are used to thinking of the term authoritarianism within that context. And we're not used to thinking about it in the terms of the Western context, particularly in the United States context, because we see the United States as kind of this beacon for democracy and liberalism. But I think there is a real threat to it. And I don't mean that the US is going to succumb to dictatorship. So what I mean is this. I mean that authoritarianism is a worldview that values order and it values authority. And authoritarian leaders have very simple and forceful politics. They're distrustful of outsiders and change. And that's personified really by Trump and the basis for his support. So this is why Trump gains supporters instead of losing some when he advocates building a wall between US and Mexico, for example, or when he vows to kill terrorists' families, or when he makes fun of or disparages weak or different people, and when he vows to rip up trade deals and to forget about traditional alliances. So authoritarianism, this idea, in contrast with liberalism, which has been the traditional founding principles of America, which values liberty and the freedom of an individual as a basis for government, I think is under some threat. So it has been the government's role in the United States, and I think in many Western democracies, to protect the individuals from tyranny, and for the government should also be structured in a way that it doesn't impose tyranny on its people. That really is the founding principle of America. But this rise in authoritarianism, I think, goes hand in hand with this anti-globalization sentiment that we talked about before, because there's been this kind of steady and growing strain of unease in the American body politic because, again, of this economic uncertainty. You have polls that say only 35% of the people say that the United States has gained from globalization, even though there's mounting evidence and data from economists saying that that's not the case. But the political elites, I think, around the world have kind of dismissed this concern among the body politic. And it was with that dismissal that I think that made Trump's rise so surprising to some in the establishment, and in why it's so dangerous to the traditional liberal democratic values that America has embodied for so long. Because a growing authoritarianism will bring things like the sacrifice of civil liberties in favor of security. It will bring things like the fear of the foreign, and particularly foreign individuals. And it will likely lead to United States that would favor force over diplomacy to pursue US interests. And again, these authoritarian type of tendencies or policies are not aligning either with traditional Democrat or Republican platforms. This is something completely different. It didn't begin and end with Trump, but I think his candidacy has given voice to it in a more mainstream way. So the third trend, I think, that we're seeing too is that we're kind of witnessing a post-factual era, or a post-factual election. So paradoxically, we're kind of in this position where we have this free flow of information through the internet and through access to all sorts of media and information in a way that we've never had before. But instead of making us more enlightened, it has brought us to a point where I think that emotions have started to take over statistics and facts. So facts don't matter. Lies and misinformation, I think, can grow in the petri dishes of the internet. Conspiracy theories have gone forward. So Trump has been kind of well known for saying things, well, Clinton should be in jail, throwing out these lines that presidential candidates have never said before. He's been saying it's a rigged election. There have been questions about Clinton's health. So all of these things actually are not new. These have been fomented for many, many years within certain corners, I think, particularly in social media and in the internet, of his supporters and elsewhere. So he's basically parroting lines that I think a segment of the American public has been talking about for many, many years. This idea that Clinton should be in jail did not come out of his mouth originally. This has been going on for quite some time. And related to that, I'll take it to kind of the fourth and last trend that I want to talk about, which is I think we are really witnessing the beginning of the collapse of one of America's major political parties, which is the Republican Party. And I don't think that's an easy thing to say, but the way that I see it, I really do see that the Republican Party in America is kind of splintered beyond all recognition. There is an open revolt by the majority of Republican voters against their nominee, their top of their ticket. And again, this relates to these past trends that we're talking about of anti-elitism and anti-globalization. The electorate, I think, has realized that the traditional Republic economic and social policies have not benefited the majority of Republican voters. And Trump has revealed and broadened these fissures, I think, between the Republican leadership and its middle-class voters. So where are the free traders and the hawks going to go in the Republican Party under Trump leadership? Where are the evangelical and Mormon voters who have been traditionally Republican to go under a Trump Republican Party? For so many Republicans, they don't recognize their party anymore, and they don't know where to go. And I will say that there is precedent in the United States for this. We're so used to the fact that the Democrat and Republican Party have been around for so long, but there have been collapses of major parties in America before. For example, in the Whig Party in the 1800s, that collapsed, and it led to the Know Nothing movement, which was surprisingly very, very much like Trump. and his supporters. So there is a precedent for this. And even if Trump doesn't win, and it is looking very unlikely that he will, the damage has been done. And unfortunately, I don't think it actually started with him. I think he just kind of gave a mainstream voice to these things. It was preceded by the Tea Party, the alt-right media, and that was really the breeding ground for, I think, a lot of this. And on the Democrat side, the election also has been equally polarizing. There has been a big split among Sanders and Clinton supporters about the very progressive wing of the Democrat Party and the more traditional wing. But I think they've managed to behave as a traditional Republican Party and again rally around the Clinton nomination as traditionally has been the norm. So in closing, I will circle back to what this all means for Australia. Australia's relationship with the United States has been rock solid really since the post-war period and even previous to that. The U.S.-Australia relationship has transcended party politics. It's crossed both Republican and Democratic administrations. But there's trouble in the waters based on what's been happening in this election for Australia. The first one is if we take a look and if we accept the premise that we see a major splintering and perhaps a collapse of the Republican Party, what does that mean about who Australia talks to in the GOP? Which voice should it heed? Should it talk to the Trump wing of the party? Should it talk to the more traditional conservative hawks? Should it talk to the establishment? Should it talk to the Ryan supporters? Who should it talk to? So there's no Republican leadership with which Australia can engage with the way that it used to. So these are all unanswered questions for Australia. And then in its totality, what does this mean for Australia, the election process, whether Trump or Clinton wins? Well, U.S. alliances have, especially with traditional allies, have very, very rarely been campaign issues. They're almost not talked about. Foreign policy in general is not talked about as much, or is not given as much importance in U.S. elections as domestic ones. Except, you state the platitudes that yes, our traditional alliances are very important and we'll maintain them, blah, blah, blah. And candidates vote to uphold and strengthen them. But in comes Trump, and now alliances are on the table. Now they're a major campaign issue. Traditional alliances are now being questioned. And even though Australia isn't being named specifically, countries like Japan, South Korea, the NATO alliance, have now been questioned by Trump, saying things, well, they have to pay us, or they'll have to protect themselves. So this obviously has Australian officials worried, for good reason. They have to now make the very obvious case that they never had to before, that Australia is an invaluable ally. And even though the Republican establishment might reject Trump's alliance positions, there is still a pressing concern. Because even if the Australian alliance remains intact, if, for example, the United States does pull Marines or Navy or Air Force assets out of Japan or Korea, as Trump has threatened to do, to punish them for failing to pay, and that will weaken the broader alliance network in the Asia-Pacific region. And anything that weakens that broader alliance network weakens Australia's position, because that alliance network is very important for the stability of the region. And if that alliance network weakens, then Australia is going to have to look about spending almost double what it has been spending in its defense budget. There have been some estimates that it's going to, defense spending is going to have to jump from 2% to 4% of GDP. So that would be an almost extra $32 billion that Australia might have to pay for its own defense. And then if the protective U.S. nuclear umbrella is somewhat threatened, what does that mean for the region? Will Japan decide to go nuclear? Will Korea? Will Australia? These are discussions that have been on the table for many years, and now they're starting to be accelerated. And any removal of troops from Japan or Korea, as Trump has threatened, will also impact and deny U.S. power projection, not just in the Asia-Pacific, but all over the entire hemisphere, all the way to the Middle East. So it'll be hugely destabilizing for the Asia-Pacific region. And the clear winners in this, with the weakened U.S. position, because it has not stuck to its traditional allies, is that the winners would be Russia and China in the region. And what does that mean for Australia? On the Clinton side, I don't think she needs any convincing of the importance of traditional alliances in Australia in particular, and I think she remains very committed to the Asia pivot. However, we do see an extremely isolationist strain in the American public right now. After the failed interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is very, very little appetite within the domestic body politic for any U.S. power projection, any interventionalist stances. So what that means is that we're asking a lot more of our allies than we used to previously. So I think Clinton is actually going to try to pressure Australia to do more in the Asia-Pacific region as much as it has done in the Middle East with the United States in similar ways. There's a big question mark about what she's going to do about the TPP. Will she support it, as she originally had done, or will she keep to her campaign promise that she no longer does? It's an open question. And I think Clinton would have a lot of questions for Australia. Will Australia be more cooperative on contested territory and navigation rights in the South China Seas, for example? So the U.S. Navy currently sails within 12 nautical miles of the territorial waters that China has claimed. Clinton would probably want Australia to do the same, which Australia hasn't done so far. They might request joint patrols, again, which Australia has not done before. Will Australia be prepared to host long-range U.S. bombers? Will they be prepared to host a U.S. aircraft carrier? All of these are questions that I think that the Clinton camp is going to pose for Australia into the future, and one that I think that Australia needs to be prepared to answer. So either way, Australia is going to be asked to do more, whether if it's under a Trump presidency and he pulls back from traditional alliances, or under a Clinton presidency where she asks more of her alliance partners. So I think what can be safe to assume within the Asia-Pacific region, within the kind of broader Western U.S. security umbrella, a lot of the things that we took for granted for the past quarter century are no longer going to be the case. And I think that's going to imply that Australia is going to have to take a much more active role in its own security, and it's going to be a much more activist ally for the United States going forward. And Australia is going to have to do a lot more work to keep the United States engaged, not only with its own relationship within the region, and I think internationally as well. So that's a lot of work for Australia to do in the coming 4 to 8 years. And I think it's not one really that the Australian foreign policy community has quite grappled with to the extent that it should have. I think there's a big attitude of, well, Trump's not likely to win, Clinton is a more traditional type of president that we're used to, it'll all be okay. Well, hopefully, but I think that there's some strategic issues that that Australia needs to answer. So I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that has given us some sort of basis for some questions and discussions, and I thank for your patience and time listening to all this.